All right. Thank you. So the special meeting actually is in reference to page 4 that we received from review legislation, and it was regarding negotiation for those. And by the way, I'm sorry, Amy, how was your vacation? You lost you for a week there.
It was great. Thank you.
Good. So I guess I can't remember where we left it off as, but obviously we were discussing the meaning of negotiation. So I think one of the concerns we had was regarding negotiation, how this was going to lead to timing of the disclosure. And I think, Amy, we were talking about that, is the concern that we had is that right now is that the way it sits, the way statute is, the fact is that it's at the beginning of the first personal meeting.
Hey, Ben, excuse me, but my page is not numbered, so could you tell me the subsection?
Yeah, is there any way for
Section we're in?
someone who's running the meeting to share that document so we can also see it and see the verbiage?
Yeah, I can't pull mine up.
I don't have
So
a copy of the document, but I can give someone permission to share it if, I mean, as a panelist, anyone who has it should be able to share it.
Brian, do you have access to it or Ben?
I do. It's so I'd be happy to share.
Okay, so, yep, so Jay will give you permission so you can share.
Or go ahead and try. And let's see, who can share? You should already have permission to share. Yep. There you go.
Is this the
That's it.
term you'd like to discuss?
That's correct.
Okay.
So I'm not quite sure where this came from and why it's here to start off with. Paulette?
I have a hard time hearing you, Ben, like you sound like muffled.
And
Maybe it's just me.
So I think what he said is he's not really sure where this has come from. And my concern was based on how it's written, providing advice or opinions on matters that are material to a transaction or showing a party real estate does not in and of itself constitute acting as an intermediary by facilitating or participating in communications between parties. So that seemed to be in direct conflict of the kind of buyer agency policy we've been following.
So
Based on how that's written.
okay, so my understanding about what was gonna, because I was not at the last meeting, having to do with negotiate is that there are some questions about when does the licensee need to enter into a buyer representation agreement with a consumer? And so, Amy, to your point, that's why you're asking about that. So we kind of said, what are your thoughts? Like, when do you think that should occur? Is it at the first showing? Is it at a second showing? What are the triggers that would then lead the consumer and the licensee to then enter into an agreement? And I think that's where you guys wanted to have more discussion on, is what I understand.
well,
Correct.
go ahead, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So what we've traditionally been doing is prior to showing any property, an agent really has to represent someone. So they either represent the seller via a listing agreement. And then they could show a house to a non-buyer client, which I think is a prospective client, like prospective something is what we had called it, and with the new definition that was set, which is perfectly fine because you give them an unrepresented person form. The agent could also represent the buyer through a buyer agency agreement, or the agent could represent both. So it could be a listing where they've signed a listing agreement, but they also have an active buyer agency client or get a lead through an online site where that person then signs a buyer agency agreement with them. So in that case, they're a dual agent. So that's the current, but I think Cindy Butts also brought up that, you know, a lot of us have communications with people via phone and or web meeting or whatever beforehand or email, where they're giving us a lot of personal information about themselves, why they're moving, how they're qualified for a loan, you know, what kind of financing they're doing and that sort of thing. So the argument then becomes is, once you start getting that information, do you need to have a buyer agency agreement signed even before you get anywhere near showing a property, simply because you've now collected a lot of essentially confidential information about the person?
Yeah, if I may, Commissioner Berquist, I believe we discussed separately, there was a proposal to add prospective client, I believe is the term that's used, that
Yep.
would protect the sharing of that information. If I recall the conversation from last time, this was specifically whether you wanted someone to enter into a contract for the showing itself. So if I recall, those were two different discussions, but perhaps I'm misunderstanding the point you were making.
I'm not sure if Cindy was saying, so that was Cindy's comment about, you know, you're getting confidential information from, like, I have conversations, like I have clients I've never met in person. You know, I have a client relocating in from California. I actually have a buyer agency agreement with them because I had a video conversation with them and I've showed them houses via video, but I've never actually met them in person. So there's other option. And, you know, I had probably weeks of conversations with them before actually signing an agency agreement with them and showing them a house. So, you know, you get into situations like that where, you know, once I start getting information and they're a prospective client, you know, should we really be signing agency before then or not, or telling people don't give us this information? You know, I don't know what her thoughts were on that, but I would think at a minimum, we should continue doing, I don't see any issue with, and I don't, you know, it's been the policy for 22 years that agency agreements be signed, but the way negotiate is written here doesn't go along with that. And I'm not sure why that's changing, that's all.
I think part of the issue had to do with, this is my understanding, is that when a consumer or prospective client meets a licensee, they haven't decided whether they feel comfortable working with that person. And so to require them to, at an initial showing, for example, to then engage them in this contractual relationship is not doing the consumer any favors. So then that's why this whole thing about negotiate comes to light is, so what is the trigger? What is it required in this relationship or this new relationship with a prospective buyer seller? What would trigger this contract? And so trying to find, I guess, some balance between both what your concerns are, Amy, and the concerns of that Cindy, and I wasn't there, so I don't, you've expressed what her concerns were. So trying to find, you know, is there a middle ground? Is there, you know, what is the industry saying? You know, I know there's might be a common practice, but it sounds to me there's some disagreement as to when this would trigger, like, so then that's why we're trying to define negotiate, which would trigger this relationship.
Our concern, can you hear me now? I can't.
Not well.
Not well, yeah.
I'm not sure. Let's see. Our concern is that at the time, and the question is that obviously it should not be at the time that we disclose who we represent at contract time. So we don't want to go to, well, yeah, now we're going to tell you who we represent when you're going upon writing up an offer. So it should be, you know, it should be, I mean, the way we have it now is, it's true. It's upon first meeting, first personal meeting. question is that and I know it's probably, it's cumbersome. It's not comfortable at all to do so on it, but still, at least we can't go out and show houses to people not knowingly, or they not knowingly, who's representing who.
Right, because if I don't have a buyer agency agreement with the person I'm showing a house to, who am I? Like, what is my purpose?
What's your capacity? That's correct.
I represent no one. So then how does that help the seller consumer? And how does that help the buyer consumer?
I think the key is the personal meeting. I mean, everyone that we interact with wants to know about real estate. So and their involvement in it, they're sharing confidential information with us. That doesn't mean that we're going to be working with them as buyers. So it's a prospective buyer. There are so many of those people that are prospective buyers, but when we actually have a personal in-person meeting and there's some execution of the fact that they want to actually be in pursuit of buying a house, is when I think it should be then a contract.
I mean, the other case with, it's not in the consumer's best interest to sign an agency agreement. That may be true. However, those agency agreements can be crafted for a specific property for one day. So if someone is not comfortable, they have no obligation to me, if it's been written that way, beyond tomorrow.
I know, but I think we're also talking about people on the phone when we haven't even met them.
Correct. Yes, I agree with that
that's
too.
what I think it would be just way too cumbersome to try to initiate a relationship at that point. I think it has to be once you're in person and they have, initiated the fact that they want to become buyers, and we're going to take them out physically.
And I mean, frankly, I typically have a phone and or video conversation with people. And then I have emailed them a copy of the agency contract before I meet them. And I say, you have to read this and be okay with it. And we're going to e-sign this before I meet you, and I will send you a copy. So like, if somebody isn't comfortable, I'm not showing them property. Like, that's how this works. So if they're not comfortable with it, fine, they can reach out to the listing agent. They can reach out to another agent that they're more comfortable with, that they've gotten a referral from a friend or a colleague. But, I understand that I need to be representing someone if I'm opening a door for a person. So, it's my obligation to explain to the consumer what this means. And, maybe that raises the bar on the profession. That's fine. And again, if the buyer feels that it's not in their best interest, they cannot sign it, or they can sign it for one day for a specific property, or they can call the listing agent and go see the property. So there are other options to them beyond signing, a 6-month blanket buyer agency agreement for the entire state of Connecticut. And, shame on agents that make buyers sign those. And I've seen plenty of buyers who have been like, I need to get out of this contract. I've gone back to the sales manager for this person to have it terminated. But there are ways, the agent should be educating the consumer and should be working to the consumer's benefit if they're not comfortable signing a longer agreement or whatever. And they should be providing it in advance. It shouldn't be sprung at somebody at a doorway when they're standing outside of a house. So, there's probably more education that needs to be happening with agents. But I also need to represent someone if I'm showing property, because what is my role if I do not represent a buyer or I do not represent a seller? What am I doing? I'm a door opener. That's not what I do. That's not my profession.
I think
Amy, oh, sorry, go ahead.
The key word that you use, I think, is explanation, is that the consumer needs the explanation, and it's an agent's responsibility. Now, the question is that how do we enforce to make sure that the agent explains this properly? What's the option that the buyer has? And that's where it gets tricky.
So what is the industry practice in terms of, Amy, you threw out a lot of examples of how this agency agreement can be modified. What is the typical practice in the industry? Is it these 6-month agreements? Is it, do you know?
Very.
I think it completely varies by agent, and
Mhm.
some of it is probably driven by the agent's level of experience, what their office policy is, if they are being directed by office policy, and or if the buyer is a referral or not. So for example, almost all of my business, so I've been doing this for 15 years, almost all of my business at this point is referral. So somebody is being referred to me by another client I've had in the past. So they have some knowledge of me. I've had an extensive conversation with them about things in most cases. And usually in that case, I'm signing like a 3-month contract with somebody. If I get someone who is an online lead that I've never met before, it's probably actually a listing that they're contacting me about, because, you know, it would come through from a listing. But if it's a buyer, in that case, I don't know what I'm getting into, and I may not want to work with this person. So because I've been in this business long enough, I know that I'm only signing a buyer agency agreement with that buyer for that specific property for like maybe a month, but probably less than that, because I don't want to be stuck with somebody that I don't want to work with. And that, again, this is a two-way street. So these agency agreements work both ways. But again, there's not really an industry standard at all. And I know, you know, there's enough agents that don't have a lot of business where they're like, oh, I'm going to have somebody sign this for a long time. And frankly, shame on them. But again, it comes down to what's an office policy? What are they being taught via their sales manager or training classes they're taking? And then what is that buyer in that specific circumstance comfortable with? Because if I just get somebody from, you know, an online lead site, they're probably not going to want to sign a 6-month buyer agency contract with me. But they also don't know enough not to want to do that in some cases. So again, it's by agent, but I would say that most buyers probably aren't signing like blanket 6-month agreements with people they haven't met before. And frankly, if they are and they don't like the agent, people are smart enough to figure out how to get out of them in many cases. Not that they should be forced to do that anyway, like the agent shouldn't be taking it.
I think we're talking about different company policy, personal policies of individuals and of agents and whatever. Now the question is that, how are we going to enforce the fact is that something that's consistent, okay, that what we should be doing or agent should be doing? And at what point in time are they going to be doing it?
Well, hasn't that already been laid out then? I mean, in our.
That's why we're talking about negotiating, because now it's questionable. Before, always that, as you know, at the meeting, at the first meeting.
Then I missed the last part of what you said. It's hard to understand.
It's the way it is now, as you know. The question is, does negotiation, the definition of what they're saying here in number 19, is this going to change the ruling regarding the first personal meeting with the buyer?
The way it's currently written in this document, I believe, is yes, it will change, because it says, or showing a party real estate does not in and of itself constitute acting as an intermediary. So in that case, it means I don't have to sign paperwork.
Well, Paula, what do you think it means legally?
I think it reads to me more discretionary. So it's saying that this is not the be all end all. So what comes before in this, providing advice or opinions on matters of material to a transaction which a person is engaged, intends to engage, or showing a party real estate, that in of itself does not constitute as negotiation. It could, like, for example, you know, when Amy, you talked about all this information that you might get from a buyer initially, all this important personal information about, you know, perhaps like how much they can spend, how much they really love this house, they have to have this, all this stuff that would undermine them if that information was given to the seller. Maybe that's enough information that would then constitute negotiate, which then would trigger this agreement.
Yeah, but I think in this case, and so like, I believe that last meeting we have, Julianne said that the way this is written does not support the current practice we follow. And I don't think we want to leave any like gray area here for interpretation, because that's what we're trying to fix anyway, is that because people feel there is room for interpretation right now. And I don't think we want that.
So have you had an opportunity to think about what, and I don't know that you've had, what the language would look like? And again, I was not at the last meeting. I apologize. I was doing interviews, so I don't know all the discussions that you had. And, you know, Ryan, if there's something that I'm missing, please chime in because you were there.
Yeah, no, I believe that where we left it off was this was our first stab at this. This was not intended to be the policy that we were, dictating down, and it was for the commission. If there's an aspect of this definition that you don't think was useful for you, that was the purpose of us bringing to you. So if you think there are tweaks that need to be made, certainly this would be the forum to do that, and it would not be over the objection of DCP.
And can I add something? This is Jim Heckman from CTR. We are still reviewing this bill as well, and we may have comments down the road, but we don't plan on doing any comments here today.
Okay.
So does the commission have any, is there any language that you want to propose? Do you want to sit on it and chew on it and
Well, I think
email us some language?
Well, meeting on Thursday. Okay, and it's to accept this or changes, I guess, on Thursday. That was the intent.
So Thursday is my understanding, because I think I know that you didn't get through all of the language in this
It's to
proposed
complete
language. So,
that's correct.
right, and I think that's why we separated out these two meetings. So this one, let's work on this negotiate, because we still have a lot of time left. Let's work on the negotiate section and language. And then the next meeting is to go through the rest of the statute.
Mhm.
Ben, I have one question about showing some property. I mean, if someone shows property without an agency agreement, then what happens if another broker comes and shows the same property to the same client, to the same person? Is there a question about who gets the commission? Neither one has an agreement. Or do neither get the commission?
Well, the way it's set up is in multiple listing, it says that the seller is going to be paying the buyer broker an agreement. He's going to be paying the buyer broker the commission.
So it doesn't make a difference who shows the house?
Typically procuring cause is seen as the agent who brings the contract that is accepted for the buyer.
With an agreement.
Correct, yeah, and you should have a buyer agency agreement in place with that buyer, then write an offer which is negotiated and accepted. And in that case, that would be the buyer's agent that has procuring cause. If there was another agent that had showed that property to the buyer previously and did not have a buyer agency agreement with them, that buyer agent does not have any say or part in that commission. Sometimes you'll see people, though, they sign 2 buyer agency agreements, which they're not supposed to do either, and then that creates a conflict.
That's in the code of ethics or something, I believe. Well, you're supposed to be asking that buyer, have you signed any other agreement with any other parties?
Yeah.
So how do we change this to kind of, I guess the main thing we're concerned about, it obviously, is the fact is that, do we go ahead and are we concerned about a buyer and an agent not having any agreement, but they're out looking at houses? This is what we want to prevent without having anything in place. Do you understand, Paulette, what our concern? Our concern is that the buyer, in other words, the agent and the buyer are going out without anything in place, okay? Because they've just met, for an example, they looked at one house and they're continuing on and looking at houses. Not knowingly, the buyer doesn't know if it's a dual agent situation or is it a buyer broker, but how is the agent acting? So we want to make sure that at some point early on in the game here, that the buyer does get an agreement with his agent.
So so that's the question. So at what point should that happen? So is the issue the sense that says showing party real estate, is that the problem with this definition, or is Is there something more?
Put a different way, is if we were to delete simply this phrase, is the definition otherwise acceptable, or are there other issues that need to be addressed?
Which phrase in this?
I'm sorry, or showing a party real estate.
So the issue potentially that becomes is that although, so if you took that segment out and removed it, but left everything else that's there, if I'm a listing agent that a person has called and they provide me with personal information, that puts them in that prospective client bin, is that correct? And then any personal information they have told me I could not share with a seller?
We can go down to that definition, but that was the
Because-
intent of the new draft, correct?
Yeah, because you want to make sure, like, again, because we have people call us on listings and they just start blabbing out all sorts of personal information about themselves, which essentially could be shared with a seller, which harms that potential buyer. So, you know, I agree, for showing property, you need to have a buyer agency agreement in place, but for other people that are sharing confidential information with us, it really shouldn't be shared with the other party. Is that covered?
Yeah. Ben, do you have quickly the prospective client language? Prospective party, sorry. So that's the definition.
All right, so
And then
then,
the restriction on the use of prospective.
Could you go back to that perspective?
Yep.
There?
Sure.
so that's really anyone, that's a buyer or a seller.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm,
And if everyone's okay, I'll go to the section that's discussed.
Yep.
please.
B is going away. Is it, if it's in brackets, it goes away. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so
But it's someplace else, right, in the definition section?
okay, so that, all right, so that,
Correct.
so that's protecting potentially a buyer and or seller, where, you know, if you go for a listing appointment and you don't get the listing, but you get all sorts of information about the seller, but then you have a buyer client who would see the house and potentially be interested in it. So that this protects both parties, the buyer and the seller.
Correct.
Where it says except as required by legal process, does that mean like material facts?
By legal process, it typically means that information has been required to be produced by court order or subpoena.
Okay. Okay. All right, so this in conjunction with that negotiate paragraph
Mhm.
protects a consumer on a seller or a buyer consumer.
That prospective buyer, party.
Yeah, so it's either or the buyer or the seller.
Mhm.
Protects them in the future for the agent using information against them, essentially,
Mhm.
Correct.
to their own advantage or their client's advantage. So that's fine. So I'm okay with like the prospective party definition and this. So can we go back to the negotiate definition?
Absolutely.
So should you mention prospective party in the negotiate definition? Or can you not do that because you're not supposed to put a definition within a definition?
No, that would be acceptable if there's a particular concept that you'd like to propose.
So you mean saying, so negotiate means acting whether directly or indirectly as an intimate by facilitating participating communication between prospective parties? Is that what you mean, Amy?
Prospective parties,
Yeah, I don't even know if you need to include it in here.
I don't think you do.
you know, yeah, I do, I agree.
Before, my concern would be we'd have to look at how negotiate is used, because I believe prospective party, and we'd have to review all of the different times that it's used.
Okay, that's fine. We don't.
May be over-inclusive for how the term is used.
Yep.
Because it's used someplace else
The term negotiate,
check,
correct?
yeah.
Yeah,
and it might not be related to prospective parties.
correct. In that negotiate typically means you're engaged in the real estate business, that you're actually have a client often, and would muddy the water. So before we make that move, I at least want to review all the different terms, times that negotiate is used.
So you don't feel we need to put perspective?
No. So my concern is that, so the second sentence in the negotiate definition.
Yes.
So if we take away showing a party real estate,
Mhm.
so then it reads, in this paragraph, providing advice or opinions on matters that are material to a transaction in which a person is engaged, intends to engage, does not in and of itself constitute acting. So then my concern is, well, does engage or intends to engage mean see property? Right? Because if I see a property, I'm intending to engage. Or I'm engaged. Right? So
No,
then
I don't think that's true. I don't think you have to see the property. Once you sign the contract, you're engaged. So.
no,
you
but
have
what
to-
I'm saying is like, this says it does not in and of itself constitute acting as an intermediary by facilitating or participating, which means that I as an agent don't need that paperwork signed. That's my understanding anyway.
So let me just read the sentence as it would be redrafted, because I'm not sure that I quite understand the question. So I just want to be clear.
Yep.
So in this paragraph, providing advice or opinions on matters that are material to a transaction in which the person is engaged or intends to engage does not in and of itself. So the qualifier there is providing advice or opinions, not. So I'm not sure that showing somebody real estate would qualify as providing advice or opinions on matters material.
Okay.
But if
Right,
I'm missing
because
something,
somebody has a phone call with me. And this happens all the time. Somebody calls about a specific property and has questions about a specific property of which I provide information, whether it's how I feel about the price or information I know about the property. And I don't need to have a buyer agency agreement with them to talk to them in that way. Because it's them asking for advice or opinions, essentially.
that's the intention of the language, correct?
Okay.
So getting, at what point do we have to have a contract or have an agreement between an agent and a buyer?
Yeah, I mean, is there a way for us to just black and white say, in order to show property, an agent must represent either the seller or the buyer or both?
Yeah, so we have another term in here called engage in the real estate business. So I think that might be a helpful next place to start looking. Let me see.
You zoomed by it before.
Oh, did I? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's in alphabetical order. It's right there, sit 15.
Engage,
There we go.
So Okay,
Engage in negotiating for offer. Negotiate for offer.
engage.
Negotiate for,
Yeah.
offer to. Two separate.
To the-
So while acting for another and for a fee, that means I have a buyer agency agreement because that's what designates that I am acting for another. Whether it's a buyer via buyer agency agreement or a seller with a listing agreement. Is that
have a
correct?
fee- Yes, for a fee, you have to have an agreement. That's correct.
Yeah.
Am I right by understanding that? Ryan? Engage in real estate means while acting for another and for a fee, to receive a fee, you must have an agreement.
Correct. And we can also, so engage in the real estate business. There's further discussion later in the document.
Is the word engage used in the negotiate?
Here. So you can. So here's the definition of a real estate salesperson. And this is the licensing requirements in which we're talking about. You have to have a license to engage in the real estate business.
Does negotiate have the term engage? Ryan?
There. Intends, but is it being used in the same? In this paragraph, providing advice or opinions on matters that are material to a transaction in which a person is engaged, intends to engage, does not in itself consider.
Yeah. So no, the answer to Paulette is no, that the term negotiate does not itself use the term engage.
It
in real
does.
estate. Engage in the real estate does not use the defined term engage in the real estate business, which is a separate defined term.
Is my mic working? Can people hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, so what Ryan was saying was right, and that's why there's the quotation marks at the top of the defined terms. So engage in the real estate business. Engage is not used as shorthand for engage in the real estate business.
Okay. Is there a different word that could use in negotiate that does not engage?
Absolutely.
Just to clarify that.
So Ryan, are you making a note that we'll look at that?
I have noted it in the
Okay,
document. correct.
yeah, because I only see our faces and I don't see. the
Yes.
comments. Yep, thank you. What else do you think in this term we should work on some language?
If anything.
Well, I believe the question that we're still need addressed is whether simply deleting or showing a party real estate satisfies if it's otherwise acceptable to the commission as a proposed definition.
Now that we know that engaging is not the same as engaging in real estate.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, if engage means things other than, physically seeing property and, and points beyond that where you're writing an offer and things like that, then yes, because I feel like information I get from that prospective client is like confidential information I get from that prospective client is covered by that prospective client definition and the subsequent paragraphs under that.
Okay, so I'll note that, well, again, assuming that there's no other objections from the commission, I'll note to remove this section. And I think we can move forward unless there's other comments or concerns.
I have no objections. Go ahead. Anybody?
Okay.
Hmm. All right,
Okay, Ryan, go ahead.
so we'll work on that. And if you think of anything else, just, as you've done before, you can shoot us an email like you did before with any concerns.
Mhm.
If there's nothing else,
No, we have another meeting
what
on
we got.
Thursday.
all right,
Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay, so then we're gonna see, we'll adjourn the meeting and
Yes.
we'll see you Thursday.
Thank you.
Okay?
thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.